Well, good morning, Redeeming Grace. I was just wanting to touch base with you here on YouTube. Also, going to try to put this up on Facebook. But I came across something sort of interesting that I think would help us in our thinking about what all is going on around us with this with the pandemic, with the outbreak, and just kind of how we should think about that. And I think it helps us to sort of go back in history and look at some of the ways that others have looked at similar situations. And so what I want to do is I just want to share what this pastor, his name is Francis Grimké, and in 1918, it was the time of the Spanish flu, and it went through D.C., and it was horrific. Between October the 1st, 1918, and February the 1st, 1919, about a year, you had 33,000 people in Washington, D.C. who contracted the Spanish flu. And out of all those, almost 3,000 people died during that time period. And so it was just a hugely devastating time for the city, for the rest of the world. And it led to a ban, just like sort of what we're dealing with, of all things, including church services in Washington, D.C. for a whole month, during 1918. And so whenever that ban was lifted, that is when this Presbyterian pastor, Francis Grimké, preached this sermon. And the sermon is entitled, "Some Reflections Growing Out of the Recent Epidemic of Influenza that afflicted our city." So that was the title of it. And basically what I want to do is I just want to read some excerpts from his observations that I think will be very helpful to us. So I think there are a few things we can learn about this. First of all, he talked about the power of God, and I'm just going to read this straight off of how I've got it pulled up here. He says, "I have been impressed with the ease with which large portions of the population may be wiped out in spite of the skill of man and of all the resources of science. Suddenly this epidemic came upon our city and country, and though every physician has been employed and every available nurse has been at work day and night, thousands have died. The awful death toll continued. Throughout all history, we find populations thinned out in this way, not in ordinary but in extraordinary ways. One night in Egypt, death found its way into every Egyptian home. In Numbers chapter 16, verse 49, we read of a plague that broke out among the people in which 14,700 perished. In 2 Samuel 24:15, we also read of another plague that broke out in the reign of David, in which during 3 days 70,000 perished. Thousands also perished suddenly as a result of volcanic eruptions or earthquake shocks. How easy it would be for God to wipe out the whole human race in this way if he wanted to. For these terrible epidemics, plagues, the mighty forces of nature, all are at his command, all are his agents. At any moment, if he willed it in this way, vast populations or portions of populations could be destroyed." And then Grimké also went on to talk about the actual disease itself, and he asked a question. He was just wondering, he said, why does it affect some people and not affect other people? And he was thinking about that, and this is what he said. He said, "The reason may be found in one sense in purely natural causes. Some were physically better prepared to resist the disease, were stronger in vital power, and so pulled through. Others, not having sufficient vitality, went down under the strain. But I believe there's also another reason, and it is to be found in the will of God. For some, the time of their departure had come, the limit of their earthly existence had been reached, and this was God's way of removing them out of this world into the next. Someday we all have to go, but how or when or where, we do not know. That is with God alone." He went on to say this, "We speak of accidental deaths at times, but there are no accidents with God. All things are within the scope of his providence." And then he continued to kind of think about these things, and he asked, why are some taken with the disease and others not? And then he meditated on Psalm 91, in the promise of preservation from illness. And with a lot of humility, he acknowledged that it's really just the secret will of God. It is God's secret will that we do not know of, why he will use a disease to take one person and to yet leave another. And so he went on to move away from those things and to kind of address what really we have on our mind these days, and that is the issue of civil liberties, and especially it comes to the forefront where we've had our governor just yesterday put out basically a 30-day window of restricting all public gatherings. But as he thought about that, this is what he said. He said, another thing that has impressed me in connection with this epidemic is the fact that conditions may arise in the community which justify the extraordinary exercise of powers that would not be tolerated under ordinary circumstances. This extraordinary exercise of power was resorted to by the commissioners in closing up the theaters, schools, churches, and forbidding all gatherings of any considerable number of people indoors and outdoors, and in restricting the numbers of who should be present even at funerals. The ground of the exercise of this extraordinary power was found in the imperative duty of the officials to safeguard, as far as possible, the health of the community by preventing the spread of the disease from which we were suffering. There has been considerable grumbling, I know, he writes, on the part of some, particularly in regard to the closing of churches. It seems to me, however, in a matter like this, it is always wise to submit to such restrictions for the time being. If, as a matter of fact, it was dangerous to meet in theaters and in the schools, it certainly was no less dangerous to meet in churches. The fact that the churches were places of religious gathering and others not would not affect in the least the health question involved. If avoiding crowds lessens the danger of being infected, it was wise to take the precaution and not needlessly run in danger and expect God to protect us. And so, anxious as I have been to resume work, and he's talking about his pastoral work and preaching and teaching and gathering the congregation together. And so, anxious as I have been to resume work, I have waited patiently until the order was lifted. I started to worry at first as it seemed to upset all of our plans for the fall work, but I soon recovered my composure. Listen to this now. He says, I said to myself, why worry? God knows what he is doing. His work isn't going to suffer. It will rather be a help to it in the end. Out of it, I believe great good is coming. All the churches, as well as the community at large, are going to be the stronger and better for this season of distress through which we have been passing. And so he talks about this. He says, listen, trust in God. God knows what he is doing. And then he really brings it down to this. He talks about how we are called to love our neighbors, how we are made in the image of God. And he says what we are to be doing as a church is this. He says the fact that for several weeks we have been shut out of the privileges of the sanctuary has brought home to us as never before what the church has really meant to us. We hadn't thought perhaps very much of the privilege while it lasted, but the moment it was taken away, we saw at once how much it meant to us. One of the gratifying things to me during this scourge has been the sincere regrets that I've heard expressed all over the city by numbers of people at the closing of the churches. The theater goers, of course, have regretted the closing of the theaters. I do not know whether the children or the teachers have regretted the closing of the schools or not. Well, I mean, they haven't closed our schools. Now they switched us all to the internet, so we're all having to work harder. But anyway, in his day, they closed it all. He says, I have heard no regrets expressed, talking about the teachers and students, but I do know that large numbers of people have regretted the closing of the churches. I hope that now that they are opened again, that we will all show our appreciation of their value by attending regularly upon their services. It would be a great calamity to any community to be without the public ministrations of the sanctuary. There is no single influence in a community that counts for more than the Christian church. It is one of the institutions particularly that ought to be strongly supported, that ought to be largely attended, and it ought to have the hearty endorsement and well wishes of every right-thinking man and woman within it. It is a great mistake for anyone to stand aloof from the Christian church. Everybody in the community ought to have a church home and ought to be found in that church home Sabbath after Sabbath. So I just wanted to pass along some of these encouragement to you, these reflections by this pastor, Francis Grimké, during the Spanish flu, the plague that came through. I pray that these will speak to our hearts as well. I mean, it shows us, when we deal with things like this, afflictions, pestilence, whatever, however you want to categorize it, it's not new. And so every generation has to confront their challenges, and we have to live our lives by faith. God changes not. And these lessons here that Pastor Grimké puts out in the midst of one of the greatest epidemics that have ever been seen, I think they will do us good for us to think about these things that he has said and to ponder these things. Well, may the Lord bless you.